A while back, I made a video on how the ancients presented what we now consider mental disorders in their mythology and religious rites. But we know the ancient world to be rich in scientific thought as well, and the field of mental health in both ancient Greece and Rome was full of pioneers, doctors and philosophers alike. So let's move on to this long-awaited part 2, and begin with the most famous of these pioneers, the father of medicine himself, the physician Hippocrates. Hippocrates identified 4 key categories of mental illness. These were mania, melancholia, paranoia, and epilepsy. Hippocrates said that they were not the result of godly intervention, but of an imbalance in what he called the 4 humours. In his major corpus of work, he defined these humours as blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much or too little of these would lead to both physical and mental illness. In the world of physical illness, the humour-based theory was debunked in around the 19th century. But what's fascinating is that when it comes to mental illness, our current approach is not so dissimilar. Physical illness is now understood to be the result of some cellular lesion or malady, but mental illness is often diagnosed as, again, an imbalance in our body's or brain's chemicals. So already we can see why Hippocrates left such a significant mark on history. However, while his prognosis might have been onto something, his prescriptions were a little more primitive, though, that said again, not so dissimilar from the way modern psychiatrists prescribe drugs to boost or contain certain chemicals in our own body. In Hippocrates' day, this drug was hellebore. After he had diagnosed an imbalance, he would attempt to purge it with this particular herb, thus attempting to eliminate an excess of the afflicting bile. In fact, we can see the use of hellebore in Antiquity as early as the legendary seer Melampus. He's a personal favourite of mine, and you can check out my other video on his full saga elsewhere. But Melampus would purge the victims of Dionysus' madness, becoming, as Pseudo-Apollodorus said it, «Then dia pharmakon kai katharmon therapean protos eurekos», the first to discover a cure through drugs and purging. Heracles too was said to have been cured of the madness which led him to kill his family by hellebore. Hippocrates was one of the first to attempt to support its use as a medicine for mental illness by science. His legacy continued for centuries through the Roman Empire and beyond. And in Plautus' comedy The Menechmi, about 2 identical twins called Menechmus who get into all sorts of confused trouble with the locals of one of the brothers' hometown, one of them is considered insane. A Hippocratic doctor is called in, but after a brief analysis decrees that non potest haec res elabori jungere obtinerie. This cannot be treated with hellebore ointment. Now, in contrast to Hippocrates was the physician Asclepiades of Bithynia, born in the 2nd century BCE. An epithet of his was Philosophicus due to his knowledge of philosophy, and he applied the atomic theories of Democritus and the botanical theories of Pythagoras. We'll come to Democritus' theory and other philosophies of mental illness soon, but keeping with Asclepiades for now, he rejected the concept of humours and instead focused on the balance or imbalance of spaces and atoms in the body, leading either to acute or chronic disease. Asclepiades, like Hippocrates, recognised mental illness as a disorder just like physical illness, but instead of purging it with drugs, he advocated a good diet and exercise. He also notably used musical therapy, which, much like today's ASMR or meditative music, was meant to calm or perk up suffering patients accordingly. Later, around the 2nd century CE, came the big daddy of ancient medicine, Galen. He thrived in the Roman Empire as an incredibly famous and talented doctor and an immensely prolific writer, possibly a corpus of 500 individual works, 10 million words in all. Marcus Aurelius described him as primum sane medicorum esse, philosophorum autem solum, first among doctors, unique among philosophers. He left a mark on almost all aspects of modern medicine. But what's really interesting about Galen is his pioneering work in the field of psychotherapy. In his book on the passions and errors of the soul, he announced that even if a man should make, by himself, as extensive an examination into his own errors as he could, he would find it difficult to discover them. This is still a fundamental of therapy today. When one is feeling down, anxious, depressed, it can be treated by identifying underlying habits or hidden potential causes for these illnesses, and then by tackling the illness at the source. Galen realized this and dedicated an entire treatise to ways to identify such causes. Galen was succeeded by other great physicians like Soranus of Ephesus, who was called by Augustine Medicinae Auctor Nobilissimus, the most celebrated teacher of medicine. But it's actually to a translator of one of Soranus' works that we're coming to now. This was Caelius Aurelianus, a Roman doctor this time. Caelius took psychology a step forward with his classifications of mental disorders. He defined phrenesis, mania, and melancholia. Now, while these labels did exist before, Caelius devoted more attention to understanding and defining them. Phrenesis is a now discarded concept similar to meningitis, referring to an inflammation of the brain resulting in delirium and fever. Mania was frenzied thoughts and physical motions and anger, something we might recognize today in the manic episodes of someone with bipolar disorder. Melancholia was diagnosed similarly to today's depression, but it also extended to what we might think of as paranoid schizophrenia, one aspect of which Caelius identified as a departure from reality into an inner world. Alongside doctors, however, were philosophers. Some, like Galen and Asclepiades, were both, but others, like Democritus, Plato, and Cicero, sought to understand the human condition without medical training. Starting with Democritus, he was a pre-Socratic philosopher remembered, amongst other ideas, for bringing atomism into the mainstream. Following in the footsteps of his tutor Leucippus, he theorized that all matter in existence was divisible down to a single particle, which to this day we still call atoms. And he took this theory into an early phase of mental health. Democritus proposed that we have a soul, psyche, composed of what he called fire atoms, atamasomata purodes. A healthy soul required a balance in one's mood, resulting in what he called euthymia. Deficiencies or excesses in mood would enliven the atoms to cause imbalance. Democritus said that by enjoying what you have, sympathizing with others, and not being jealous would avoid what he called keres, the resulting diseases or defects of the mind, gnome. It stands to reason then that Democritus recognized the particularity of what we might call depression or anxiety, and developed his own ethical ideology to counteract them. Epicurus was a very famous continuer of this philosophy with his idea of the good life. Epicureanism is a little misunderstood in today's age. Rather than indulging in only the finest things, Epicurus taught us to enjoy what we have, to find as much pleasure in bread and butter as we would in lobster and steak. Contentedness in this way would ease mental distress, allowing us to enjoy the world around us exactly as it is. Now, mental health and legislation begin to be explored with more formal logic in the works of Plato, unsurprisingly in his work The Laws. Building on earlier ideas, Plato draws our attention to the word mainesthai, which had interestingly developed from the Homeric meaning to be enraged or furiously drunk, to a more contemporary to be mad. He then offered a legal distinction be made between someone, say, acting aggressively in a bar, and someone with a serious mental disorder. He's not particularly compassionate towards these people, offering little in the way of public welfare, but Plato is one of the first to recognize that the mentally ill should not be punished for any illegal acts they might commit as a result of their illness. Instead, it should be their families which are responsible for looking after them, keeping them in guarded confinement. If they fail in that duty, it is they, as the custodians, which ought to be punished. Plato's theory on this was one of many notoriously rejected by his pupil Aristotle. Aristotle tended to be quite extreme in his attitudes towards neurodiversity, as his views on the mentally ill were really quite savage. Very little attention is paid to them in his works, and the comments he makes on disorders like mania, depression, and even anxiety suggests that they hold little to no value for society at large and should be ignored. In fact, taken in the wider context of his works, in this case the politics, a link can be drawn between those with a lower cognitive function, i.e. the mentally ill, and Aristotle's infamous proclamation on slavery, that these are by nature slaves, hutoimen eisi fusse douloi. We also find an early recognition of psychopathy in Aristotle, who identifies people incapable of distinguishing between right and wrong. These people he likens to theres, or beasts, and suggests that they be expelled from any good society. Much more discussion of the mind and soul in the tradition of philosophy continues from Aristotle, but I think to consider all of it would not only be too much for this video, but would also start to duplicate the points being made. So coming back to mental health in the legal world, we move from Greece back into Rome again, and to the great orator himself, Cicero. Cicero, like Plato, spoke on the topic mentioned earlier, the nature of mental disorders in the legal field. To him, there were two key legal definitions of madness, each with different connotations, insanus and furans. In his speeches, Cicero seeks to elaborate on a much earlier set of Roman laws, the 12 tablets from the time of the Roman kingdom. These lay out certain conditions for those diagnosed with mental disorders. Cicero gives us a great insight into the Roman perception of insania, which, in the legal sense, seemed to denote a more sense of general foolishness, while furans he defines as a blind and uncontrollable state of mind. Hanc enem insaniam, quae iuncta stultitiae patet latius, a furore disjungimus. This insanity, which is known to be a sort of foolishness, we distinguish from madness. Cicero goes on to say that those charged with misconduct under insania can still be punished, while those under furans are not allowed to own property, and, like in Plato's laws, are not to be punished themselves. In fact, over the course of the Roman Republic and later Empire, attitudes towards the mentally unwell became more humane than they were under Greek law. This attitude became a tenet of Roman law, still the basis of some civil law today. The proclamation of the 13th century lawyer Henry de Bracton, Furiosus solo furore punitur, a madman is punished only by his madness, can be directly linked to earlier lawyers like Cicero and Ulpian. Not only was this quoted directly in the trial of George III's would-be assassin in 1800, but it continues even now in the form of pleading not guilty by reason of insanity. And last, but certainly not least, is the example of Seneca, which, while not explicitly philosophizing about any one particular mental disorder, brings us close to the modern practice of psychiatry. He was no Galen, but recognized in his journey to understand the nature of virtue, the power behind giving someone advice in order to nurture them and bring their mind and soul into a healthier state. In one of his letters on morality, he writes a dialogue where one of the speakers tries to refute the view of a fictional representation of the earlier philosopher Aristotle of Chios. Aristotle had said that the madness of an individual and the madness of a whole people differs only in its symptoms. The cause is the same, and therefore the treatment should be the same. One big legislative medicine directed by philosophy. Seneca retorts that they are not the same, and the treatment of a suffering individual can be instigated through philosophical teaching and inquiry. If you imagine a trauma patient sitting on a couch before a psychiatrist, Seneca's words might well provide a good starting point. Non docet admonitio, sed advertit, sed excitat, sed memoriam continet, nec patitur relabi. Plerque ante oculos posita transimus, admonere genus ad hortandi est. Advice does not teach, but it directs and engages the mind, enforces the memory, and doesn't let it slip. We miss a lot which is right in front of our very eyes. Advice is really a sort of incitement. In other words, this is almost a primal paraphrasing of modern psychiatry. The source of one's trauma is not always unknown to a patient, merely repressed. Advice and gentle nourishment by a guide can help us locate the source of our problems and offer us a roadmap to self-healing. And we should often think about, Seneca continues, whatever is healthy and keep returning to it, so that it may not only be familiar to us, but also ready to hand. Quaecumque salutaria sunt, saepe agitari debent, saepe versari, ut non tantum nota sint nobis, sed etiam parata. And on those uplifting words, I'll leave you to ponder and perhaps look further into the rich and remarkably astute world of mental health in antiquity.